but the story I'm about to share feels like it belongs to someone else. It's messy, complicated, and something I never thought I'd have to live through, let alone talk about. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. My mum, Caroline, had this incredible career, a high-powered job that made everyone around her respect and admire her. She was the type of woman people called an inspiration. But behind closed doors, it was different. She was always busy, always gone, and when she was home, she was distant. It wasn't just about work, it felt like she didn't know how to connect with me, or maybe she didn't want to. Don't get me wrong, I loved her. I still do. But love doesn't always mean understanding. Growing up, there were nights I sat in my room and wondered if she even noticed how lonely I was. And then there was Greg, my stepdad. He came into our lives when I was around 13. At first, I wasn't sure about him. He wasn't like my mom. Where she was sharp and no nonsense, he was easygoing and warm. He'd crack jokes, talk to me like I mattered. For a while, I thought he was the glue that held us together. I wish I could say everything stayed simple, that I was just a teenager, dealing with normal teenage stuff, but it didn't work out like that. Looking back, I don't even know when things started to change. Maybe it was the nights when Mum was working late, and Greg and I would end up watching TV together. Or maybe it was the way he'd look at me sometimes, like I wasn't just a kid anymore. All I know is that something shifted, slowly, quietly, but it did. This isn't the kind of story you share lightly. It's not something you just tell a friend over coffee or laugh about years later. It's heavy, and it's ugly, but it's also my truth. And if I've learned one thing through all of this, it's that hiding from the truth doesn't make it go away. I don't know if sharing this will help me find closure or if it'll just make me feel more exposed, but I do know that stories like mine happen more than anyone wants to admit. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there will listen to this and feel a little less alone. Growing up, my mum always seemed like she was running out of time. Meetings, deadlines, phone calls, they swallowed up her days. Even when she was home, it felt like she was somewhere else entirely. If she wasn't behind her laptop, she was on the phone, pacing the house and throwing out quick instructions. Dinner's in the fridge. Don't forget to lock the door. Good night, Myrtle. But there was no warmth, no lingering moments where she'd stop, look at me and just be present. I told myself it was normal, that everyone's mom was like that. I mean, she was providing for us, right? Keeping a roof over our heads, making sure I had what I needed. But even as a kid, I knew something was missing. I just didn't know how to say it, or who to say it to. That's where Greg came in. When Mom married him, it was almost like a light switched on in our house. He had this way of making everything seem easier, like life didn't have to be so serious all the time. He'd sit down and talk to me, really talk, not just about school or chores, but about things I liked, books I was reading, shows I was watching, stuff that made me laugh. It was nice. It was more than nice. For the first time in years, I felt like someone in the house actually saw me, and the funny thing is, I didn't even realize how much I needed that until I had it. Greg filled a space I didn't know was so empty. But here's the thing about filling a gap like that. It's tricky. It's easy for lines to blur, for roles to get confused. At first, it was little things. The way he'd smile at me when I told a story like he was hanging on every word. Or the way he'd notice if I seemed upset. Even when I didn't say anything, he was attentive, thoughtful, and charming. It felt good. Too good, maybe. There was this one night that stands out. Mum was working late again, and it was just me and Greg at home. He'd made dinner, something simple like pasta, and we were sitting at the table. I remember telling him about a fight I'd had with a friend at school. I was frustrated, on the verge of tears, and he just listened. Not in that way adults sometimes do, where they're only half paying attention. He really listened. When I finished, he reached across the table and put his hand on mine. It was such a small thing, but it felt huge. He looked at me and said, "Myrtle, you're amazing, you know that. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not." I don't know why. but those words hit me hard, harder than they should have. After that, I started noticing things. The way he'd compliment me. "You're so smart, Myrtle." Or, "You have such a good heart." The way he'd find reasons to spend time with me, like asking for my help with something around the house. It wasn't anything overt, nothing I could point to and say, "This is wrong." But it was there. This shift. And I think we both felt it. Looking back, I wonder if things could have been different, if I'd seen it for what it was and stopped it before it went too far. But at the time, it didn't feel dangerous. It felt safe. Like for once, someone actually cared. Before I continue, I just want to say, this story isn't easy for me to share. It's raw and it's messy, and there are moments I wish I could erase. But if hearing it makes someone out there feel less alone, then it's worth it. So if this resonates with you, please take a moment to like, share, or subscribe. It's a small way to let me know you're listening and that this story matters. Thank you. Now, there's a point where confusion starts to feel like gravity. It pulls at you, keeps you up at night, and makes you question everything, your choices, your feelings, even yourself. That's where I found myself with Greg. I wish I could say it was sudden, that it hit me out of nowhere and I didn't have time to process it, but the truth is, it wasn't like that. It was slow, creeping, like the way water seeps into cracks before you even notice the damage. I started looking forward to the time we spent together. Not in a casual way, but in a way that made my stomach twist when I thought about it later. Greg wasn't stupid. He must have noticed. He started opening up to me more, talking about things that felt intimate, like how hard it was to keep the house running with Mom gone so much, or how lonely he felt sometimes. I'd never thought of adults as lonely before, but when he said it, I believed him. It made me feel closer to him, like we were two people who understood each other in a way no one else did. And then there were the little things, the way he'd touch my shoulder when he walked past, or how he'd sit just a little closer than he needed to on the couch. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone else would notice, but enough to make my heart race. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if I was imagining things. Was I reading too much into it? Or was there something real happening between us? At night, I'd lie in bed and replay everything in my head. The way he smiled at me, the way he laughed at my jokes, the way he looked at me, like I wasn't just a kid, but someone who mattered. I hated myself for feeling that way. I hated that I couldn't make it stop. One day, he asked me to help him fix a leak under the kitchen sink. It was such a stupid thing, so ordinary, but it felt different. We were so close and I could feel the tension, even if neither of us said a word. When we finished, he looked at me and said, "You're such a big help, Myrtle. I don't know what I'd do without you." It was just a sentence, a throwaway line, but it stayed with me. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And that's when the guilt started to creep in. I knew it wasn't right. I knew I shouldn't be feeling what I was feeling. But knowing didn't make it go away. If anything, it made it worse. I'd catch myself daydreaming about him, then snap out of it and feel like the worst person in the world. I'd try to avoid him, but it never lasted. He was always there, always kind, always Greg. I started wondering if he felt the same. Was I just a kid with a crush? Or was there something real between us? I didn't know. I couldn't know. But the not knowing, it was unbearable. And I wanted to talk to someone, to say it out loud, but who could I tell? My friends wouldn't understand, and my mom, well, she was barely part of the picture. So I kept it inside. I kept pretending everything was fine, even when it felt like I was falling apart. It started on a night that seemed like any other. My mom had gone out for the evening, some business dinner or networking event, and left me home alone with Greg. It wasn't unusual. She trusted him, and honestly, so did I. Greg and I had spent the evening watching TV, a random movie we both half paid attention to. I remember curling up on one side of the couch, him on the other. It felt normal, even comforting. At least it did at first. Somewhere during the movie, I shifted uncomfortably, tugging at my jeans. I mumbled something about how tight they felt, joking that I was getting fat. It was an offhand comment, the kind I made to hide how self-conscious I was. Greg turned to me and said, "You're not fat, Myrtle. You're beautiful." His tone was calm, almost too calm. I didn't know what to say, so I just laughed awkwardly, trying to brush it off. But then he moved closer. His hand rested lightly on my knee just for a moment. "You really are, you know," he said. "You're beautiful." That word. It felt so heavy coming from him, like it carried more meaning than it should have. I froze. My heart raced, and I felt heat rising to my face. I told myself I was imagining it, that it wasn't what it seemed. But then he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a peck, not a quick brush of the lips like you'd give someone as a mistake. It was deliberate, slow, full of intent. And I didn't move. I didn't pull away. I just sat there, shocked, unsure of what was even happening. My mind was spinning, screaming that this was wrong, but my body didn't listen. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to understand. Why had he done it? Was it my fault? Was I reading too much into it? I felt sick with guilt, but couldn't shake the curiosity. So, a couple of days later, I went to him. I needed answers, needed to know why. He was in the kitchen, casually making himself coffee, like nothing had happened. I asked him about the kiss. I wanted him to deny it, to tell me it was a mistake and that it wouldn't happen again. But instead, he looked at me and said, "Myrtle, I've had feelings for you for a while now. You're the reason I've stayed with your mom." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there and listen to him justify what he'd done. But I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen again. And then he kissed me again. This time, I pushed back. I told him it wasn't right, that it couldn't happen. But he didn't stop. He told me I was special, that he couldn't help how he felt. His hands were on me, my shoulders, my waist, and I felt like I was trapped, like there was no way out. I should have run. I should have fought harder, but I didn't. And I hated myself for it. When it was over, he acted like nothing had happened. He cleaned up his coffee cup and asked if I wanted anything to eat, like it was a normal night. But it wasn't normal. It was the night everything I thought I knew about trust, about family, about myself shattered completely. The relationship went on for about 9 months, even though things were rocky for a good part of it. At one point, I got kicked out of the house after a fight with my mum. I don't even remember what it was about, but I packed my things and left. For a while, I thought that was the end. I thought that being out of the house would mean being out of his reach, that maybe I could finally breathe again. I'd come back to visit on weekends, though. Not for him. I told myself that every time. But to see my mom. And even then, I'd feel his presence, like he was waiting for an opportunity. I'd catch him staring at me during dinner, or he'd find some excuse to talk to me alone. It made my skin crawl. I hated him. But I hated myself more for not doing something, for not telling anyone. By Christmas, I had moved back in. My mum and I had made up, and she welcomed me home like nothing had ever happened. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could move on. I was doing better. I was starting to feel more stable. I was even getting ready to come off my antidepressants and mood stabilizers. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could see a future where I wasn't drowning in guilt and confusion. But Greg didn't let go. He didn't understand, or maybe he didn't care, that I was done. I'd told him it was over, told him that if he ever touched me again, I'd tell my mom. I thought I'd been clear. I wasn't. He started creeping into my room at night, just sitting there, watching me sleep. Sometimes he'd wake me up, whispering things I didn't want to hear. It was like he was trying to remind me that he still had control, that no matter how much I wanted to move on, he wouldn't let me. What made it worse was how bold he got. He'd make comments in front of my mum, things that sounded innocent on the surface but carried so much weight beneath. And she never noticed. She thought he was talking to her, not me. I don't know if I wanted her to figure it out or if I was terrified she would. Maybe it was both. The relationship finally ended when I started dating someone else. I'd been with this guy for almost 9 months. A real relationship this time, one that didn't make me feel sick inside. Being with him made me realize just how wrong everything with Greg had been. I felt like I could breathe again, like I could finally start putting the pieces of myself back together. But Greg didn't stop. He still found ways to insert himself into my life, to remind me of the mess we'd made. And then, one day, it all came crashing down. My mom found out. I don't even know how. If she overheard something. If she finally saw what I couldn't hide. All I know is that one night she confronted me, and the truth spilled out before I could stop it. Everything. The months of secrecy, the lies, the guilt I'd been carrying like a weight on my chest. She didn't say much, she just cried, and then she called the police. Greg ended up incarcerated. He tried to deny it, of course. Tried to paint me as the one who misunderstood, the one who led him on. But the truth was out, and there was no going back. I thought that would bring me some relief, that maybe I'd finally be free of him. But it didn't feel like that. It just felt empty. My boyfriend broke up with me. He couldn't handle it, couldn't wrap his head around what had happened. I think he thought I'd cheated on him with Greg. I didn't even know how to explain it to him, so I didn't. My friends were split. Some stayed by my side, telling me it wasn't my fault, that I'd been unstable and manipulated. Others cut me off completely. I couldn't blame them. I didn't know what to believe about myself, so how could I expect anyone else to? Now I'm just trying to figure out how to move forward. I'm not looking for pity. I know what happened was disgusting, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. But I also know I was young, confused, and manipulated by someone who should have known better. I'm trying to learn how to forgive myself, even if I'm not sure I deserve it. So here I am, putting it all out there. Not because I want attention, but because I don't know what else to do. If you've listened this far, thank you. I don't know what I'm hoping to find by sharing this, but maybe someone out there has been through something similar. Maybe someone has advice on how to move forward, how to heal. I'm listening, and I'm trying to believe that it's not too late to put the pieces of myself back together. If you've made it to the end, it means more to me than I can say. Please, if you think this story could help someone else, share it. And if you want to follow along as I figure out where to go from here, like and subscribe. Your support means everything right now, more than I can put into words. Thank you.